So you're playing a wizard in Baldur's Gate 1, but you don't know what you're doing. There are all these spells to choose from, and you have no idea what they do. Well, you are in the right place because I am going to go over what spells are good, and we're going to go over them quickly. The following is a quick guide to introduce you to the various spells that are actually worth using in Baldur's Gate 1. I'm not going to go over every spell, because some of them are only good in a few scenarios, while others are just completely useless. Level 1 spells. Sleep. Sleep is by far the most useful spell at the start of Baldur's Gate 1. Casting this on a group of enemies will put them to sleep, and they will automatically be hit by anyone attacking them. It starts losing power during the second half of the game, but by that point you'll have even better crowd control spells. Magic Missile. While initially only doing a small amount of damage, Magic Missile is useful at level 1 for interrupting enemy casters. It has a fast cast time, and it always hits. It also scales as you level up, adding 1 extra missile at levels 3, 5, 7, and 9 for a total of 5 missiles. If you see an enemy wizard casting a spell, you definitely want to try and interrupt it with one of these. Blindness. Blindness reduces an enemy's field of vision. If they can't see you, they won't be able to cast spells or use ranged attacks. Identify. Identify is a spell that will save you 100 gold every time you cast it to identify an item. It also saves you a trip back to town to identify your loot, although gold is by no means difficult to come by in this game. Friends. Friends is a deceptively useful spell. Adding 6 charisma, this comes into play mostly for shopping trips. If you have a base charisma of 14, this spell will boost it to 20, which will net you a 25% discount at any store you visit. Grease. Grease is an okay spell. It will snare enemies, causing them to take longer to get to you. Be careful though, because it will also snare your own party. Spook. Spook will fear a single enemy. This may seem underpowered when you can get Horror at level 2, but the real benefit to this spell is that it reduces your enemy's chance to resist this spell the higher level you become. It is especially useful for illusionists, as this is an illusion spell and the chance for the enemy to resist the effects will be even lower. Illusionists also will not have access to Horror, so this spell gives them access to a fear they otherwise can't learn. There are also a lot of useful spells for level 1 that can be cast from a scroll. Why would you want to cast spells from a scroll instead of memorizing them? First off, scrolls are cast as if your caster level is 6, which means they will be more powerful than memorized spells until you reach that level. They also don't take up a spell slot, so you can keep them around for emergencies or situations where they might be handy, but don't need to be memorized in a slot every day. Good spells to cast from scrolls include the following. Magic Missile is useful when cast from a scroll because it will send 3 missiles, even at level 1. Burning Hands is also a good, quick scroll you can read for damage early on. It's not a great spell, and generally you don't need to try and memorize it, but it is very good in the early levels when you are hurting to get more damage out. The downside being you have to get pretty close to the enemy to use it. Chromatic Orb is also a useful scroll. Free damage, you can cast it at range, and it may reduce the enemy's accuracy. Protection from Petrification is also a useful scroll to keep a copy of. Occasionally you'll come across some pesky basilisks which can petrify you with a look. This will stop that from happening. Find Familiar is useful to cast from scroll because you only ever need to cast it once. Generally you'll want to talk to your familiar and put it in your pack because if it dies, you permanently lose 1 constitution point. If you are just creating your character, you'll want to take Sleep, Find Familiar, and either Identify or Magic Missile. Find Familiar is useful at the very beginning because summoning a familiar will increase your hit points, and that is extremely helpful at level 1. The only time you don't want to select it as a starting spell is if you are a sorcerer, because sorcerers learn spells differently, and being a spell you don't want to cast more than once, you definitely don't want to waste a precious spell slot on it. Level 2 spells. Horror. Horror is a great spell because it is an AoE fear which can take a good number of enemies out of the fight. If someone casts something on your group and a big dirt face appears on the ground and now your guys are running around, that means they cast Horror on you. You'll want to cast this on them before they cast it on you. Web. Web breaks the game in your favor. Not a lot of enemies are immune to it except spiders, and every round it has a chance to paralyze enemies and stop them from doing anything. It will also cause all attacks to automatically hit. The only drawback to this spell is that your own party is not immune to its effects, and they have a tendency to wander into it if they try to attack an enemy at the very back of it. However, you can avoid being stuck with a status called Free Action. You can get this effect from either Free Action potions, Rings of Free Action, the +2 sword Spider's Bane, or a cleric casting the level 4 spell Free Action. This spell is also useful because if you overlap two of them, both webs have a chance to paralyze the same enemy. Glitter Dust. Glitter Dust has a chance to blind everyone in a small area, just like the spell Blind. It can also reveal invisible enemies. The effects of this spell don't last very long, but they do last long enough to tip a fight in your favor. Invisibility. Invisibility is good for traveling wizards because it lasts for 24 hours and will save you from getting sniped by enemy archers in ambushes. It is also useful for sneaking around enemies to loot chests and what have you before sneaking back out. Just make sure to have an invisibility potion handy to sneak back out quickly if something sees you. Resist Fear. If you don't have a cleric or a cavalier or a bard, this spell is a must-take. Enemy casters love to cast horror, and this spell will stop your team from running away. You can also preemptively cast this spell if you are expecting a fight, and the protection it grants lasts a while. Melf's Acid Arrow. Like Magic Missile and Spook, this spell also scales up as you level up, causing damage for more rounds the higher you are. It is useful to throw on enemy casters, as the periodic damage will interrupt their spellcasting. Mirror Image. This spell will conjure up shadow clones who can take hits for you. The clones aren't guaranteed to take the hit, but there's a good chance. You'll see enemy wizards use this spell a lot, because it's actually very good. Notable scrolls for level 2 are Detect Invisibility and Resist Fear. Detect Invisibility is situationally handy if you know there's an invisible enemy around, and it will also dispel Greater Invisibility, a spell enemy wizards like to use that will leave them partially invisible and harder to hit. Resist Fear is also useful to have on scroll in case you need it in an emergency. Level 3 spells. Haste. Haste is one of your best level 3 spells. It will speed up your whole group and give everyone an extra attack every 6 seconds. It doesn't stack with free action effects, but if you're webbing enemies and wailing on them with protected melee, it isn't a huge loss anyway. Dispel Magic. Great for stripping enemies of their buffs or clearing your own group of debuffs, but it can also potentially wipe out your own buffs as well, so be mindful when casting this. Fireball. This spell will blow things up. You probably don't actually need to memorize too many of these because there are a lot of Wands of Fire in the game that will do that for you, and don't take up spell slots, and don't have a cast time, but still really great damage if you don't have anything else to memorize. Skull Trap. It's like Fireball, but deals magic damage instead of fire. You can also use it to set traps, but that is situational at best. Invisibility 10 feet. This is a group AoE invisibility spell. It is an extremely rare scroll to find, but if you do, it will let you sneak your whole party past groups of enemies. Melf's Minute Meteors. These will do good damage and have a high enchantment level, so enemies that require high enchantment levels to hit will still be hit by this spell. Remove Magic. This is a party-friendly dispel magic, so you can use this to strip enemies of their buffs without having to worry about removing your own. Spell Thrust. A good spell for removing magic protections from enemy mages, particularly the ones in the big blue orbs. Most of the time, enemy mages don't come pre-buffed and will die before they can get one off, but some will immediately have it up, in which case you will need to remove it with this before your other spells will be able to take effect. Good spells to have in scroll form are Dispel Magic and Remove Magic. Level 4 spells. Greater Malison. An amazing spell, Greater Malison will reduce your enemy's magic evasion, making them more likely to be caught in webs or take full damage from fireballs and skull traps. Improved Invisibility. This spell can be cast on yourself or other party members, but unlike the level 2 spell Invisibility, this spell will remain in effect once you've taken an action. You will appear semi-transparent, and enemies will have a penalty to hit you. Using this on your frontliner can make them harder to hit. Just make sure he is visible so the enemy doesn't ignore him and target your more squishy party members. Minor Sequencer. This spell lets you store 2 memorized spells of level 2 or lower and instantly release them. It is useful for loading up 2 web spells or 2 instances of Magic Missile. Stone Skin. Like a better version of Mirror Image, Stone Skin takes hits for you without you taking any damage. Very useful for preventing things like backstabs or melee characters who are focusing on you. Confusion. A great spell for controlling enemies. They may still choose to attack you, but they are just as likely to wander around or stand still. Minor Globe of Invulnerability. A great spell if you are expecting to have a bunch of spells coming your way. It will block any spells of 3rd level or lower. If you see an enemy with this buff, a Pierce Magic will remove it. Level 5 spells. Chaos. Chaos is a better version of Confusion. Cloud Kill. Cloud Kill kills weaker creatures straight up and does consistent damage to anyone standing in it. Something to be aware of is this spell does no damage if you are immune to poison, so Cavaliers or characters protected with a protection from poison scroll can safely enter the cloud. And that's it for spells. There are more spells than those presented here, and some of them do have their uses, but this should get you started in your spell-slinging career. As a final tip, don't sleep on wands. Wands are ridiculously powerful, particularly Wands of Fire, Wands of Frost, and Wands of Paralyzation. Wands of Fireball are great for launching fireballs and ending fights before they even begin. Wands of Frost do a huge amount of single target damage, but you have to be careful with them because you can potentially freeze and shatter enemies, which will destroy any loot that they are carrying except for plot-related items. Wands of Paralyzation are also extremely useful, holding enemies in place and causing all hits to land, especially good if you manage to get a Greater Malison off beforehand. Wands of the Heavens are also very good, but are only usable by clerics and druids. Wands of Monster Summoning are useful for summoning extra targets to take hits for you. Wands of Fear are also useful because it's like an instant cast horror spell that can also be used by clerics and druids. And that wraps up this quick introduction to spells in Baldur's Gate 1. Hopefully you learned something. Now gather your party and venture forth.